My father smiled across the banquet table and said, "Only pity got you invited." After 16 years in the Navy, I swallowed the insult for my mother's sake. I let him think I was just a lowly clerk. I let him think I was useless. But he had no idea what was coming. Just hours later, the honored guest of the night stood up, snapped a crisp salute, and called me Admiral in front of everyone. Before I tell you what happened next, and how my father's smug smile turned into sheer terror, please take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with this story. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now let me take you back to where this nightmare began. My name is Sarah Jenkins. I am 35 years old. At 18, I left my family home to join the United States Navy. Over the past 17 years, I worked my way up from an enlisted sailor swabbing decks to a highly decorated officer in the Naval Supply Systems Command. I put myself through night classes, earned my commission, and revolutionized defense logistics. Just a month ago, in a highly classified ceremony at the Pentagon, I was fast-tracked and frocked to Rear Admiral to root out West Coast contracting corruption. I manage billions of dollars in federal supply chains. But to my family back in Seattle, I am just a failure. They still think I am a low-level accounting clerk who counts boots in a damp warehouse. They have no idea who I really am, and I never bothered to correct them, because my family has always been committed to misunderstanding me. The heavy rain was coming down in sheets as I pulled my rental car up to the valet stand at the Emerald Crest Country Club in Seattle. It was a Friday evening, and the sprawling cedar and glass mansion overlooking the Puget Sound was entirely rented out for the Jenkins family. Tonight was a massive event. It was a dual celebration serving as both the 30th corporate anniversary of my father's defense logistics company, Jenkins Global Freight, and the official rehearsal dinner for my younger sister Chloe's wedding. I stepped out of the car wearing a simple tailored navy blue dress. I wore no medals, no rank insignia, and no uniform. Just plain civilian clothes. Despite having spent years deployed in combat zones managing supply chains under enemy fire, and staring down terrifying foreign officials walking into a room full of my own blood relatives made my chest tight and my hands sweat. I took a deep breath, handed my keys to the valet, and walked through the grand double doors into a foyer dripping with crystal chandeliers and the overwhelming scent of expensive champagne. I had not even reached the coat check when a heavy hand clamped down on my shoulder. I turned around to face my father. Richard Jenkins looked exactly as he always did, wearing an impeccable charcoal suit, his silver hair styled perfectly, and a glass of scotch clutched in his hand. But I knew from public financial filings that his company was struggling. He was desperate for a massive government contract to save his failing business from bankruptcy. He did not say hello. He did not ask how my flight from Washington was. He just looked me up and down, his eyes lingering on my modest dress, his lip curling into a sneer of pure disgust. "Do not get comfortable, Sarah," he said, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "Only pity got you invited to this table. Do not think for 1 second that you are here because we want you here. You are an embarrassment. You are here solely because your mother cried about it, and it looks bad to our corporate investors if my own daughter is excluded from the family wedding photos." The words hit me like a physical strike to the ribs. Pity. I oversaw logistics operations that kept entire fleets of nuclear submarines and aircraft carriers running. I had earned the respect of 4-star generals. But to the man standing in front of me, I was nothing but a stain on his perfect corporate image. I opened my mouth to respond, ready to tell him that I did not need his pity and that I would happily turn around and drive back to the airport. But before the words could leave my throat, my mother Barbara hurried over. She was clutching a glass of white wine, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darting nervously around the busy foyer to see if any of the wealthy guests had overheard the insult. "Please, Richard, stop," she hissed, grabbing his arm tightly. "Sarah just got here. Let us just have one nice night. Please, Sarah, just keep the peace. Do not start a fight tonight. Just keep the peace." That had been my mother's life motto for 35 years. And keeping the peace always meant that I had to swallow my pride, absorb the abuse and make myself as small as possible so my father and my younger sister could shine. I looked at my mother's pleading eyes. I saw the deep exhaustion etched into her face. She lived in a mansion, but she was utterly terrified of her own husband. I closed my mouth. I nodded slowly. I would stay and endure the humiliation. Not for him, but purely for her. I watched my father turn on his heel and walk away to greet a local politician. Instantly, his face transformed into a warm, welcoming mask of charm. The contrast was genuinely sickening. As I walked past the coat check and entered the main ballroom, I thought about how it had always been exactly this way. Growing up in our household, love came with a strict ranking system, and my sister Chloe was the undisputed star. Chloe was 5 years younger than me, but she took up all the oxygen in the room. If Chloe wanted private ballet lessons, my father wrote the check without blinking. When Chloe crashed her brand new convertible at age 17, my father blamed the wet roads and bought her a better car the very next day. But when I was 18 and asked for a small loan to help pay for college tuition, my father sat me down in his office and laughed in my face. He told me I lacked the ambition and the intellect to succeed. He said investing in my education would be throwing good money after bad. That was the exact day I walked into a military recruiting office and enlisted in the Navy. I wanted to build something of my own. I wanted to earn my worth. For 17 years, I built a highly successful career based on pure merit, hard work, and discipline. But whenever I came home on leave, the family narrative never changed. Chloe was the beautiful, brilliant success story. I was the sad, frumpy older sister who had to join the military because she had absolutely no other options in life. My father loved to tell his wealthy friends that I was a low-level clerk. I never corrected him because it was easier to let him believe his own arrogant lies than to constantly fight for a basic level of respect he was completely incapable of giving. The ballroom was magnificent and buzzing with loud anticipation. Gold-draped tables filled the room, towering floral centerpieces sat on every surface, and a jazz quartet played softly in the corner. Waiters circulated continuously with silver trays of expensive hors d'oeuvres. I walked past the front tables reserved for politicians and corporate executives and found my assigned seat. It was at the very back of the room, positioned directly next to the swinging doors of the kitchen. Every single time a waiter rushed in or out, I was hit with a blast of heat, the loud clattering of plates, and the smell of industrial dishwater. It was a deliberate placement. It was a physical manifestation of exactly where I stood in the Jenkins family hierarchy. I was the spare child kept out of sight, tolerated, but never respected. I sat down, smoothing my napkin over my lap, feeling the familiar hollow sting of rejection. I told myself to just endure the night. I told myself I would fly back to the Pentagon tomorrow and leave this toxic environment behind me forever. But as I sat there sipping a glass of ice water and watching the wealthy guests mingle, I began to notice something strange. My father looked incredibly desperate. Beneath his practiced charming smiles, he was sweating profusely. He kept checking his expensive watch and glancing nervously toward the private executive offices located down the hall. I watched him pull Chloe aside. My sister was wearing a white silk designer dress that likely cost more than my first car. She had been throwing her head back, laughing loudly and holding court near an elaborate ice sculpture. But when my father whispered something in her ear, her smile vanished. Chloe had always coasted through life on a golden paved road. When she graduated college with a mediocre communications degree, my father immediately hired her as the director of marketing for Jenkins Global Freight. She had a 6-figure salary and a corner office despite having zero actual corporate experience. Tomorrow she was marrying Trent Lawson, the company's vice president. Trent was a man cut from the exact same cloth as my father. He was arrogant, ruthlessly ambitious, and utterly devoid of a moral compass. I watched Trent march over to join my father and sister. The three of them stood in a tight circle, their body language tense and panicked. My military training kicked in. I had spent years analyzing human behavior in high-stakes negotiations, and right now I was watching three people who were backed into a dangerous corner. When my father told me that pity got me invited, it was not just a passing cruel comment. It was a calculated attempt to break my spirit and crush my confidence before the night even began. He wanted me feeling small. He needed me insecure and eager for his approval. I did not understand why at that exact moment. Usually he just ignored my existence entirely. But tonight, his hostility felt highly pointed. It felt strategic, like he was making absolutely sure I knew my place, so I would not dare ask questions or step out of line when the time came. I watched Trent point sharply toward the private office doors, then gesture subtly toward my table at the back of the room. My father nodded, his face grim. A cold realization washed over me. I was not invited out of pity. They needed something from me, and whatever it was hiding behind those office doors. The heavy oak doors swung wide open, and the noise level in the room actually shifted to accommodate the arrival of the golden child. Chloe swept into the ballroom wearing a tailored white silk gown that swept the floor, her arm looped tightly through the crook of Trent Lawson's elbow. Trent was the vice president of my father's defense logistics firm, a man who wore custom Italian suits and possessed a smile that never quite reached his eyes. Together they looked like a magazine advertisement for corporate royalty. My mother instantly abandoned her conversation with a local city councilman to rush forward, throwing her arms around Chloe as if she had just returned from a long deployment. The irony was entirely lost on them. I watched from my assigned seat at the back next to the kitchen doors as my sister held court. People gravitated toward her naturally, drawn by the undeniable charisma that my parents had funded since she was a toddler. Trent stood beside her, shaking hands and projecting the image of a titan of industry. I intended to remain invisible in my corner, sipping my water and counting down the minutes until I could politely excuse myself. But Chloe had a sixth sense for locating me whenever she needed an audience for her superiority. She detached herself from a group of real estate developers and made a direct line for my table, her heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood. Trent followed a step behind, looking bored. Chloe stopped in front of my table, her perfectly manicured hands resting on her hips. She looked at my simple navy blue dress, letting her gaze travel from the hemline up to my unadorned neckline. She let out a soft, pitying sigh. "Sarah," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "you actually came. And you wore that. It is so brave of you to just show up without even trying to blend in. I told Dad we should have sent you a gift card to buy something suitable for the country club, but he said you prefer the practical look." I kept my expression entirely neutral. Years of standing at attention while superior officers inspected my unit had taught me how to lock my face into a mask of polite indifference. "The dress is fine, Chloe. Congratulations on the wedding rehearsal. The room looks beautiful." Trent chuckled a dry, abrasive sound. "It should look beautiful, Sarah. Your father dropped a small fortune to secure this venue. But I guess you would not know much about corporate event budgets working in a government supply closet. How is the boot-counting business these days? Are the warehouses treating you well?" "The Navy is keeping me busy," I replied evenly. I did not mention the billions of dollars in federal supply chains I managed. I did not mention the 4-star generals who relied on my logistics reports. I let them enjoy their ignorance. Chloe waved her hand dismissively, clearly bored by the mention of my career. "Well, since you are already standing near the service doors, do something useful. The waitstaff is completely ignoring our side of the room. Be a good sister and fetch us 2 glasses of the vintage champagne from the private bar near Dad's temporary office. The bartenders out here are pouring the cheap stuff. Go on, hurry up. I need to make a toast in 10 minutes. She turned her back to me before I could even reply, grabbing Trent's hand and dragging him back toward the center of the room. She treated me exactly like the hired help, assuming my sole purpose was to facilitate her comfort. I took a deep breath, letting the sting of her entitlement wash over me and then dissipate. Military discipline is a powerful tool. It allows you to separate your emotional reaction from your physical response. I decided to get the drinks not out of obedience, but to get away from the suffocating atmosphere of the main dining room. I needed a moment of quiet. I navigated through the sea of wealthy guests slipping past tables draped in heavy gold fabric and towering floral arrangements. The country club was massive, a sprawling labyrinth of grand halls and private meeting rooms reserved for premium members. My father had rented out the executive suite down the western corridor to use as a staging area for his corporate partners. It was supposed to be a quiet zone off limits to the general partygoers. The corridor leading to the private bar and the executive office was dimly lit, lined with expensive oil paintings and thick carpet that completely muffled my footsteps. The noise of the jazz quartet and the clinking glasses faded into a dull hum the further I walked from the ballroom. I spotted the private bar station ahead, but there was no bartender in sight. Just a row of crystal flutes and a silver ice bucket holding 2 bottles of expensive champagne. I reached for a bottle, intending to pour the drinks and retreat. But as my hand closed around the chilled glass, I heard a voice. It was sharp, panicked, and entirely devoid of the charming polish I had just witnessed in the ballroom. It came from the executive office just a few feet away. The heavy mahogany door was cracked open by a fraction of an inch, likely left ajar in a moment of careless haste. I froze. The voice belonged to Trent Lawson. "You promised me this was handled," Richard Trent hissed. The raw panic in his tone made the hairs on my arms stand up. "You told me the Seattle port expansion bid was a guaranteed win. If the Navy auditors look too closely at our financials right now, we are going to federal prison. Do you understand me, federal prison? We have falsified 3 years of safety compliance records and inflated our operating budget by millions. We are bleeding cash. If we do not secure this $50 million contract tonight, the entire company collapses by Monday morning." I stood perfectly still, my hand still resting on the cold champagne bottle. My father's defense logistics company was bidding on a massive Navy contract for the Seattle port expansion. It was a project I was intimately familiar with, though they had no way of knowing that. I listened as my father's voice answered, sounding strained but desperately trying to maintain control. "Keep your voice down, Trent," my father snapped. "The auditors are not going to look closely. We just need the insider's signature to bypass the final secondary review. Once we have a verified naval officer's authorization on the character and compliance addendum, it automatically fast-tracks the bid. The Oversight Committee rubber stamps it because it looks like an internal approval. I have the paperwork sitting right here on the desk." "And how exactly are we getting a naval officer to sign off on a fraudulent compliance report?" Trent demanded, his voice thick with contempt. "We do not have anyone on the inside who has the clearance to push this through. You are gambling my freedom on a theoretical signature." There was a brief, heavy silence in the office. When my father finally spoke, the absolute cruelty in his words hit me harder than any physical blow ever could. "We have Sarah," my father said. My breath caught in my throat. I pressed my back against the wall, straining to hear every single word. Sarah Trent scoffed loudly. "Are you insane? She is a nobody. She is a low-level supply clerk. She does not have the authority to bypass a federal audit. She has a military identification number and an active duty security clearance," my father countered smoothly, his voice dripping with condescension. "That is all the automated system requires for the compliance addendum. The federal database does not care if she is a general or a glorified warehouse janitor. It just scans the credentials. We put the paperwork in front of her tonight, buried in a stack of routine background check forms for your security clearance. We tell her it is a standard family reference requirement for the wedding." "And you think she will just blindly sign it without reading the fine print?" Trent asked, sounding skeptical but intrigued. My father laughed. It was a dark, amused sound that made my stomach churn. "Trent, you do not understand my daughter. She is desperate. She has spent her entire pathetic life trying to prove she belongs in this family. She is a complete failure who joined the military because she had no other prospects. If I tell her that signing these papers will help the family, if I give her just a tiny crumb of validation, she will sign whatever I put in front of her. She will sign anything if she thinks it will make me love her." The silence in the hallway was deafening. I stood alone in the dim light, staring at the sliver of space between the door and the frame. For 35 years, I had believed that if I just worked hard enough, if I just stayed quiet and caused no trouble, my family might eventually see my value. I had endured the mockery, the isolation, and the constant comparisons to Chloe, because I believed that deep down, beneath the harsh exterior, my father still possessed a basic level of parental affection. I was wrong. I was nothing to him. I was not a daughter. I was a tool. I was a disposable asset he planned to use to commit a $50 million federal fraud. He was fully prepared to let me take the fall, to let me go to federal prison, just to save his failing company and his golden child's lifestyle. The betrayal was so profound it physically ached. A younger version of myself would have burst into tears. A younger version of myself would have pushed open that door, confronted them, and demanded to know how a father could do this to his own child. A younger version of myself would have run out of the country club, booked the first flight back to Washington, and spent years wondering why I was so unlovable. But I was not that young girl anymore. I was a highly trained military leader. I had faced hostile forces, navigated geopolitical crises, and commanded thousands of personnel. The shock burning through my veins did not turn into sorrow. It hardened into cold, absolute military precision. My father thought I was a desperate clerk who would blindly sign her life away for a scrap of his affection. He thought he could use my name to bypass a federal audit without facing any consequences. He had no idea that the woman standing on the other side of that door was not a warehouse janitor. He had no idea he was attempting to defraud a newly appointed Rear Admiral of the United States Navy, the exact officer tasked with dismantling corrupt defense contractors on the West Coast. I slowly pulled my hand away from the champagne bottle. I did not fetch Chloe her drinks. I did not run away. Instead, my mind began rapidly constructing a tactical counter-offensive. I needed to see those documents. I needed to know exactly what they were planning to put in front of me. I turned my head, scanning the corridor. The catering staff was busy preparing the main course in the kitchens. The ballroom was completely occupied by the speeches and the jazz band. The corridor was entirely deserted. I took a quiet step back, leaning against the patterned wallpaper, completely hidden in the shadows. I waited. 2 minutes later, the heavy mahogany door clicked open. My father and Trent stepped out into the hallway, smoothing their expensive suits and adjusting their ties. They walked briskly back toward the bright lights and loud music of the ballroom, completely unaware that their entire criminal conspiracy had just been compromised. I watched their retreating figures until they disappeared around the corner. The door to the executive office had not fully latched shut. It was slightly ajar, exposing the dark, quiet room inside. My heart beat in a steady, measured rhythm. The emotional devastation was locked away in a tight box in the back of my mind. Right now, I had a mission. I stepped forward, pushed the heavy door open, and slipped quietly into my father's private office. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, instantly sealing off the distant thumping bass of the jazz band and the clinking glasses of the country club ballroom. I stood completely still for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The executive office smelled of expensive polished leather, stale cigar smoke, and that specific brand of arrogant, peppery cologne my father had worn since I was a child. It was a scent that used to make me shrink into myself, a chemical signal that judgment was about to enter the room. Now it just smelled like a target. I did not reach for the overhead light switch. The pale yellow glow from the parking lot security lamps filtered through the wide, rain-streaked windows, casting long and distorted shadows across the elaborate Persian rug. I did not need bright lights for what I was about to do. In the far corner of the room, positioned behind a massive oak desk, sat a heavy vintage steel filing cabinet. It looked imposing, the kind of reinforced metal beast designed to intimidate civilian office workers and keep nosy secretaries at bay. But to a woman who had spent months stationed at forward operating bases, a woman tasked with securing classified intelligence assets in active combat zones, it was nothing but a minor inconvenience. I walked over to the cabinet, my high heels sinking silently into the plush carpet. I ran my fingers along the top drawer. It was secured by a standard 4-pin tumbler lock. My father probably thought it was completely impenetrable. I reached into my small beaded evening clutch. Right tucked alongside my lipstick and my hotel keycard, I carried a discreet reinforced metal hair clip that doubled as a tension wrench. It was a practical habit I had picked up years ago during specialized field training and never bothered to drop. I knelt on the floor, the silk fabric of my navy blue dress pooling around my knees. I took a slow, measured breath, letting the ambient noise of the rain hitting the window glass fade completely from my awareness. I inserted the tension wrench and applied a tiny fraction of pressure. 1 pin. I felt the tiny mechanism yield under my improvised tool. The mechanical click was soft but entirely distinct in the quiet room. 2 pins. I remembered my father standing in the bright foyer just 20 minutes earlier, looking me up and down with sheer disgust, telling me that only pity had gotten me an invitation to this table. 3 pins. I remembered Trent Lawson's panicked, frantic voice echoing in the hallway, confirming that they were preparing to use my signature to commit a massive federal felony. 4 pins. The lock mechanism gave way with a heavy, satisfying clunk. I pulled the top drawer open. The heavy metal glided silently on well-oiled tracks. Inside it was an absolute chaotic mess of overflowing manila folders, tax notices, and bank statements printed on stark red paper. Even a cursory glance at the top few files painted a desperate picture of a man drowning in overwhelming debt. I saw past due notices from industrial creditors. I saw final warning letters from major supply vendors threatening legal action. Jenkins Global Freight was not just struggling to maintain its market share. The company was completely hemorrhaging cash. They were existing on fumes, borrowed time, and the illusion of wealth. But I was not here for his late payment notices. I ran my fingertips along the very back of the deep drawer, feeling for any structural anomaly. There it was. Tucked carefully behind a false cardboard divider sat a thick black leather binder. It felt incredibly heavy when I pulled it out, substantial and dense, like it contained the physical weight of my father's actual sins. I stood up and rested the binder flat on the polished mahogany desk, turning it so the ambient light from the window illuminated the cover. A crisp white label had been slipped into the clear plastic sleeve on the front. It read, Project Trident. I opened the heavy cover. The very first page was a master summary of a Department of Defense contract bid for the Seattle Port Expansion Initiative. The total federal valuation printed at the bottom of the page was $50 million. I felt a cold, sharp chill wash over my skin as I started flipping through the subsequent pages. My eyes darted across the dense text, processing the financial data and the legal jargon with the speed and precision the United States Navy had drilled into me. The deeper I went into the binder, the more horrifying the reality became. This was not just a desperate corporate bid. It was an absolute masterclass in premeditated federal fraud. My father and Trent had completely fabricated 3 entire years of occupational safety compliance records. They had artificially inflated their operating budget, using doctored spreadsheets, forged massive insurance bonds, and created a complex network of phantom subcontractors to make Jenkins Global Freight look like a thriving, highly capable enterprise with a massive workforce. In reality, the financial disclosures I was looking at proved the company was legally insolvent. If they managed to win this specific federal contract, they would receive a massive upfront disbursement of taxpayer money. The documentation made their exit strategy crystal clear. They planned to take that initial cash injection, quietly pay off their crippling personal debts, funnel the rest into offshore accounts, and likely vanish before the port expansion project inevitably collapsed under their sheer incompetence. But to get their hands on that federal money, they had a major obstacle. They had to bypass a rigorous secondary audit conducted by the Naval Supply Systems Command. They needed a verified military insider to rubber stamp the final compliance addendum, bypassing the standard civilian oversight committee. I turned to the 4th tab in the binder and my stomach plummeted. My own name stared back at me in bold black ink. Sarah Elizabeth Jenkins, Underneath my name was my social security number, my date of birth, my current duty station, and my military identification number. They had somehow managed to pull my basic unclassified personnel file. But staring at that page, I immediately spotted their fatal mistake. The security clearance level listed right next to my name was printed as secret. That was the entry-level clearance I had held 12 years ago when I was a junior enlisted sailor working night shifts in a dusty supply depot. They had absolutely no idea that my clearance had been upgraded multiple times over the past decade. They had no idea I currently held a top-secret sensitive compartmented information clearance. They genuinely believed I was still the lowly, unremarkable clerk they loved to mock at family holiday dinners. I flipped to the next page to understand exactly how they planned to execute the trap. I found the final authorization sheet. It was a digital federal submission form printed out for physical review. The signature line at the very bottom required an active duty military officer to verify under penalty of perjury that the bidding contractor met all federal safety and ethical standards. But my father had not attached this signature page to the massive $50 million contract. He had separated the final authorization sheet and deceitfully clipped it to the back of a completely different document. It was attached to a standard harmless-looking civilian background check form required for Trent's wedding venue security. The mechanics of the setup were chillingly brilliant in their simplicity. They were going to walk up to me tonight in the middle of a crowded, loud ballroom and hand me a stack of mundane wedding papers. They would point to the bottom line and tell me they needed my signature to secure the country club for Chloe's reception. They knew I would never meticulously read the fine print of a family wedding document while surrounded by 100 drinking guests. Once I blindly signed it, Trent would take that specific page, scan it digitally, attach it to the $50 million federal bid, and hit submit. The automated defense contracting system would scan my military credentials, verify my authentic signature, and instantly approve the massive contract. I felt physically sick. My hands grasped the edges of the desk to steady myself. But the absolute worst was yet to come. Tucked into the very back leather pocket of the binder hidden behind the forged tax documents was a printed email chain. The paper felt heavy and coarse in my hands. The top email was from Trent to my father, complaining bitterly about the extreme risk of the upcoming military audit. But the reply printed directly underneath it was what made all the breath leave my lungs. It was an email from my younger sister, Chloe. It was sent from her personal account, time-stamped just 2 days ago. I read her words in the dim light of the office, and the very last remaining shred of hope I had for my family evaporated into dust. Chloe had written, "Do not panic, Trent. Dad has it totally under control. Once Sarah signs the character reference paperwork tonight, your company gets the $50 million. We pay off the debt, we keep the house, and we finally get our massive payout. If the feds ever figure out the safety records are fake down the line, who cares? The final authorization has Sarah's signature on it. If it goes south, the Navy blames her. She is the one who goes to federal prison, not us. It is a win-win. A win-win." I read those 3 words again, my eyes burning. My own sister. The girl I had protected from neighborhood bullies when we were children. The girl whose extravagant wedding rehearsal I had flown completely across the country to celebrate. She had typed those words with casual, breathtaking cruelty, fully endorsing a plan that would entirely destroy my life, strip away my hard-earned freedom, and lock me in a federal penitentiary for decades. All so she could maintain her luxury lifestyle, keep her fancy sports car, and marry a corporate fraud. And my father. My father had printed this email. He had sat in this very chair, read his youngest daughter's gleeful plan to sacrifice his oldest daughter, and he had placed it in this binder as a strategic asset. He agreed with it. He was actively executing it right now, sipping expensive scotch in the ballroom, while I stood in the dark holding the physical proof of my own planned execution. For a long time, I just stood there in the silence. The muffled jazz music from the ballroom seemed to mock me through the thick walls. The little girl inside me, the one who had spent her entire life just wanting her father to be proud of her military service, finally and permanently died in that dark office. The daughter who always kept the peace was gone, but the Admiral remained. I pulled my personal cell phone from my clutch. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was a useless reaction to a tactical threat. I opened my camera application and systematically photographed every single page in the Project Trident binder. I captured the forged safety compliance records, the fake payroll documents, the manipulated authorization sheet, and finally Chloe's devastating email. I made sure the lighting was perfect and the text was entirely legible. When I finished, I carefully returned the documents to their exact original order. I placed the thick binder back behind the false cardboard divider in the top drawer. I closed the metal drawer, pressing my thumb against the lock until I heard the firm click of the pins resetting into their secure position. I smoothed down the fabric of my dress and picked up my purse. My father believed I was a desperate failure who would blindly sign her life away for a tiny scrap of his affection. He thought he could use my name to bypass a federal audit without facing any consequences. He was about to learn that you do not set a trap for a decorated military officer unless you are fully prepared for the entire fleet to show up at your front door. I stood perfectly still in the dim glow of my cellular phone screen, letting the reality of my family's betrayal wash over me in freezing waves. I did not shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response to overwhelming grief, but the grief had instantly evaporated the moment I read my sister's gleeful email plotting my journey to a federal penitentiary. In its place, my military training took complete command. I was no longer a daughter standing in her father's study. I was a high-ranking naval officer operating behind enemy lines, and I had just discovered a massive cache of hostile intelligence. I moved with the silent, mechanical precision I had honed during years of deploying to unpredictable overseas environments. I opened my phone's camera application, double-checking that the flash and shutter sound were entirely disabled. One by one, I flipped the heavy pages of the black leather binder. I photographed the fabricated safety compliance logs. I captured the doctored financial spreadsheets that falsely proved Jenkins Global Freight was a solvent enterprise. I took crystal-clear images of the phantom subcontractor invoices and the manipulated $50 million Department of Defense contract bid. Finally, I focused my lens on the printed email chain where my father and my sister openly discussed setting me up as their sacrificial lamb. I checked every single image for clarity. The text was sharp. The evidence was irrefutable. I closed the heavy leather cover and slipped the binder exactly where I had found it, tucking it securely behind the false cardboard divider in the very back of the vintage steel filing cabinet. I closed the metal drawer and applied pressure until the 4-pin tumbler lock clicked solidly back into place. I wiped the handles with the fabric of my dress to remove any trace of my fingerprints. I took a slow, measured breath. The air in the office tasted like stale cigars and greed. I smoothed down the front of my simple navy blue dress, tucked my phone back into my small beaded evening clutch, and stepped out into the carpeted corridor. I pulled the heavy mahogany door shut behind me, ensuring the latch caught completely. The walk back down the hallway felt entirely different than the walk toward the office. Minutes ago, I had been an insecure woman trying to escape the suffocating arrogance of her wealthy family. Now I felt an absolute terrifying calm. I was a loaded weapon, and my father was about to pull the trigger on himself. I pushed through the heavy wooden doors and re-entered the grand ballroom. The atmosphere hit me like a physical wall. The jazz quartet was playing a lively tune in the corner. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the sea of wealthy guests, and the air smelled of roasted tenderloin and expensive champagne. It was a picture-perfect celebration of corporate success and family unity. It was an absolute illusion. I navigated through the crowded tables, keeping my posture slightly stooped and my gaze lowered. I had to reconstruct the mask they expected to see. I had to become the frumpy, low-level supply clerk who desperately craved her father's approval. I slipped past a group of local politicians and made my way back to my assigned seat near the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. I sat down, picked up my glass of ice water, and took a small sip. My hands were perfectly steady. It did not take long for the predators to circle. Through the crowd, I spotted my father and Trent Lawson moving toward the back of the room. They were walking shoulder to shoulder, projecting the image of two titans of industry commanding their domain. Trent leaned over and whispered something to my father. My father nodded, his face locked in a mask of warm paternal authority. They were executing their play. I kept my eyes fixed on my water glass, pretending not to notice their approach until they were standing directly over my table. Sarah. My father said, his voice dropping into a low, entirely fake register of gentle concern. I am glad you are still here. I thought you might have run off to sulk. I looked up, letting my shoulders round forward just a fraction. I gave him a weak, uncertain smile. I am just enjoying the music, Dad. The venue is really beautiful. Trent stepped forward, pulling out the chair next to mine and sitting down without waiting for an invitation. He placed his elbows on the linen tablecloth and leaned in close. He smelled like expensive mint cologne and nervous sweat. My father remained standing behind him, placing a heavy hand on my shoulder. I had to consciously force my muscles not to flinch at his touch. We have a tiny favor to ask you, Sarah, Trent said smoothly. His smile was perfectly practiced, showing bright white teeth. As you know, Chloe and I are getting married tomorrow. The country club management has a very strict protocol for high-profile events. Because my company handles sensitive logistics, they require a routine background character reference from an immediate family member. My father squeezed my shoulder, his grip tightening just enough to feel slightly threatening. It is just bureaucratic red tape, Sarah. Absolute nonsense. But we have to jump through their hoops to keep the venue secured for your sister's big day. Trent reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a crisp manila folder. He opened it and slid a small stack of papers across the table toward me. The top sheet featured the elegant embossed logo of the Emerald Crest Country Club. It looked entirely legitimate, but my highly trained eyes instantly recognized the heavy stock paper underneath. The margins, the specific font layout, and the tiny serial numbers printed at the very bottom corner of the second page were unmistakably Department of Defense forms. They had cleverly stapled the country club letterhead over the federal compliance addendum to hide the military seal. We just need your signature on the bottom line of the second page. Trent continued, pulling a heavy gold fountain pen from his pocket and laying it next to the documents. It basically just says, "You verify that I am an upstanding citizen. Since you work a government job, even a low-level one, your signature carries a little extra weight with the venue's security team." I stared at the papers. I let my hand hover over the gold pen, feigning hesitation. I looked up at Trent, widening my eyes slightly to project a perfect mixture of confusion and insecurity. "I do not know, Trent," I said softly, my voice trembling just a fraction. "I am not really supposed to sign official documents outside of my supply office. My supervisor gets very strict about using our military identification numbers for civilian matters." My father's hand dug painfully into my collarbone. His charming mask slipped, revealing the raw, calculating hostility simmering just beneath the surface. "Do not be difficult, Sarah," my father snapped, his voice dropping to a harsh, commanding whisper. "We are not asking you to launch a missile. We are asking you to sign a basic character reference for your future brother-in-law. Your sister has been planning this wedding for 2 years. Do not ruin this for her because you want to play by the rules of some pathetic warehouse supervisor." I looked down at the table, biting my lower lip. I let a long, uncomfortable silence stretch between us. I needed them to feel the desperation. I needed them to push harder. "You owe us this, Sarah." My father continued, leaning down so his face was inches from my ear. His breath smelled like scotch and malice. "You have done absolutely nothing for this family. We put a roof over your head growing up. We fed you. We clothed you while you accomplished nothing. For once in your life, you have a chance to be useful to us. Do not be selfish. Sign the paper." Trent tapped his finger impatiently against the linen tablecloth. "Just sign the document, Sarah. Let us get back to the party." The psychological trap they were running was textbook manipulation. Isolate the target, apply overwhelming familial guilt, create a false sense of urgency, and demand immediate compliance. It was a strategy that would have absolutely broken the 20-year-old version of me. But the woman sitting at that table had negotiated with foreign warlords. She had overseen logistics for carrier strike groups. My father's cheap emotional blackmail felt like a child playing with toy soldiers. "Okay," I whispered, keeping my eyes fixed on the floor. "I will sign it. I just want to help the family." My father let out a heavy sigh of relief, his grip immediately loosening on my shoulder. "Good girl," he murmured patronizingly. "I knew you would do the right thing." I picked up the gold fountain pen. It was heavy and perfectly balanced. I pulled the stack of papers toward me, pretending to briefly scan the country club letterhead before flipping to the second page. Just as I had seen in the hidden binder, the signature line on the Department of Defense Compliance Addendum was exposed right at the bottom. To the untrained civilian eye, a signature is just a signature. But to a commissioned officer in the United States Navy, a signature is a legal weapon. During my advanced leadership and intelligence training at the Naval Supply Command Headquarters, I was briefed on specific countermeasures for hostile environments. Officers who manage billions of dollars in federal funds are prime targets for extortion, kidnapping, and coercion. We are taught a very specific, highly classified protocol for signing documents under duress. We all have our standard legal signature registered in the federal database. But we also register a secondary signature, the countersign. The countersign is visually identical to our normal handwriting, but it contains 3 deliberate microscopic errors. A missing middle initial, a specific loop on the first letter that slants backward instead of forward, and a distinct break in the cursive flow of the last name. When a federal document is scanned into the Department of Defense network, the automated system cross-references the signature. If the system detects the standard signature, the document is approved. But if the system detects the exact parameters of the countersign, it does not just reject the document. It triggers an immediate silent red flag. It alerts Naval Criminal Investigative Service that a high-ranking officer is being actively coerced, extorted, or held against their will. It essentially screams fraud to the highest levels of the federal government. My father and Trent thought they were incredibly smart. They thought they had found a brilliant loophole to steal $50 million from the taxpayers and pin the entire crime on my shoulders. They had no idea I was about to drop a federal anvil directly onto their heads. I uncapped the gold pen. I did not hesitate. I pressed the nib to the heavy paper and signed the signature line. I left out my middle initial. I looped the S in Sarah backward. I broke the cursive flow right in the middle of Jenkins. It was the perfect, flawless execution of a military distress signal. I capped the pen and pushed the folder back across the table toward Trent. I looked up at him, allowing a weak, submissive smile to cross my face. "There you go," I said softly. "I hope Chloe has a beautiful wedding." Trent snatched the folder off the table so fast, he nearly knocked over my water glass. He quickly flipped to the second page, his eyes locking onto the ink. A massive, victorious grin spread across his face. He looked at my father and gave a sharp, definitive nod. The insider signature was secured. The $50 million contract was practically in their bank account. "Perfect," Trent said, standing up and buttoning his expensive suit jacket. He did not even bother to say thank you. He just tucked the folder tightly under his arm, like he was holding a winning lottery ticket. My father stepped back, his entire demeanor changing instantly. The fake paternal warmth vanished, replaced by his usual cold indifference. He looked down at me one last time, brushing a speck of dust off his lapel. "Do not drink too much of the free water," Sarah, my father, sneered. "We have important investors to entertain tonight. Just stay out of the way." "I will, Dad," I replied softly. I sat alone at the back table and watched them walk away. They marched back into the center of the grand ballroom, their heads held high, laughing and clapping each other on the back. They strutted toward Chloe, who was waiting near the bar. When Trent held up the manila folder, my sister actually bounced on her heels and clapped her hands together in sheer delight. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully ruined my life to fund their luxury empire. I picked up my glass of ice water and took a long, refreshing drink. The trap was set. The bait was taken. All I had to do now was call in the fleet. I did not stay for dessert. The moment Trent walked away with the signed compliance forms tucked under his arm, I knew the clock was ticking. I found my mother near the ice sculpture, pasted a pained expression on my face, and told her I had a blinding migraine. She looked relieved to see me go, probably hoping my absence would prevent any more awkward questions from their wealthy friends. My father did not even look my way as I slipped out the side doors of the ballroom. He was too busy laughing with a group of local politicians, absolutely certain he had just secured a $50 million payday. The rain was still pouring down as the valet brought my rental car around. I tipped the young man, climbed into the driver's seat, and pulled out of the country club parking lot. I did not drive fast. I drove with the careful, deliberate caution of a woman carrying a live grenade. The drive back to my downtown hotel took 40 minutes, and I used every single one of those minutes to mentally transition. I had to lock away the deeply wounded daughter who had just heard her own family orchestrate her journey to a federal penitentiary. I had to bury the shock of my sister openly writing about letting me take the fall for their crimes. There would be time to process the emotional devastation later. Right now, I had a job to do. I parked in the underground garage of the Marriott and took the service elevator straight to my floor. My room was at the very end of the hall, isolated and quiet. I unlocked the door, stepped inside, and immediately engaged the deadbolt and the heavy metal security latch. I closed the thick blackout curtains, sealing the room off from the glowing Seattle skyline. I took off my civilian heels, tossed my beaded clutch onto the bed, and walked over to the modest black duffel bag sitting in the corner of the room. To the untrained eye, my luggage looked like the cheap gear of a low-level clerk. But beneath the layers of casual civilian clothing was a false bottom. I unzipped the hidden compartment and pulled out a heavy matte black Panasonic Toughbook. It was a highly classified piece of military hardware issued strictly to senior command staff. I set the computer on the hotel desk and flipped open the screen. The machine did not require a standard password. It required a retinal scan and a complex biometric thumbprint verification. I leaned into the scanner, waiting for the green confirmation light. The system verified my identity, and the encrypted military network booted up. It is incredibly strange to live a double life. For 17 years, my family had aggressively pushed the narrative that I was a failure. They genuinely believed I spent my days counting combat boots in a damp warehouse because I was not smart enough to succeed in the private sector. They loved to tell their country club friends that I was just a lowly supply clerk. It made them feel superior. It made Chloe feel like the undeniable golden child. I had never corrected them because giving them the truth would have required a relationship I simply did not want to maintain. But the truth was vastly different. I did not count boots. I managed the logistics infrastructure that kept the entire United States Pacific Fleet operational. I had commanded supply chains under hostile fire. And just 1 month ago, inside a highly secured briefing room deep within the E-ring of the Pentagon, the Chief of Naval Operations had stood before me. He had pinned a single heavy silver star to my uniform collar. I was not a clerk. I was a Rear Admiral lower half. I was one of the youngest officers to ever achieve flag rank in the Supply Command. My promotion was fast-tracked and highly classified because of my specific new assignment. The Department of Defense had noticed massive financial discrepancies originating from West Coast defense contractors. Millions of taxpayer dollars were vanishing into thin air, specifically surrounding the new Seattle Port Expansion Initiative. The Pentagon needed a flag officer with an immaculate record and deep roots in the Pacific Northwest to lead a quiet, aggressive task force to root out the corruption. They sent me. I had deployed to Seattle 2 weeks ago, working completely out of uniform, gathering intelligence from the shadows. I knew the port expansion project was plagued with fraud, but I had absolutely no idea my own father was the primary architect of the theft until tonight. The universe has an incredibly twisted sense of humor. Richard Jenkins thought he was scamming a naive daughter. In reality, he had just handed a signed confession directly to the federal task force commander assigned to destroy him. The encrypted communication portal glowed to life on my laptop screen. I initiated a secure video link directly to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service headquarters. The connection was established in less than 10 seconds. The face of Special Agent David Bradley appeared on the screen. He was the lead investigator assigned to my task force, a sharp, unsmiling man who possessed a legendary hatred for corrupt defense contractors. He was sitting in a secure command center in Washington, surrounded by glowing monitors and junior analysts. Admiral Jenkins Bradley said, his voice crisp and professional. "We just received an automated critical alert from the Cyber Command Division. The system flagged a contract submission from Jenkins Global Freight 3 minutes ago. The digital signature attached to the compliance addendum triggered a Level 1 duress code. Are you in immediate danger, Admiral?" "No danger, David," I replied, my voice steady. "My physical perimeter is entirely secure. I am alone in my hotel room." The duress code was intentionally deployed to freeze the contract disbursement and initiate immediate federal oversight. I watched Bradley exhale a short breath of relief. "Understood, Admiral." The automated system locked the $50 million disbursement the second your countersign was processed. The funds are frozen in an escrow holding account. The suspects believe the money is inbound, but they will not be able to access a single dime. Can you confirm the nature of the fraudulent submission? I connected my civilian cellular phone to the classified laptop using a secure transfer cable. "I am uploading a highly sensitive evidence package to your terminal right now," I told him. "I infiltrated Richard Jenkins' private executive office at the country club tonight. He was maintaining a physical ledger he called Project Trident. You are about to receive 54 high-resolution images." I watched the progress bar on my screen as the photographs transferred across the encrypted network. I waited in silence as Bradley opened the files on his end. The only sound in my hotel room was the heavy rain striking the glass window. For nearly 5 minutes, Bradley did not say a single word. I could see the reflection of the documents glowing in his glasses as he clicked through the images. I knew exactly what he was looking at. He was looking at the forged safety bonds. He was looking at the artificially inflated payroll records and the complex web of shell companies my father had created to hide his impending bankruptcy. And finally, I knew he had reached the very last photograph. I saw his jaw clench tight. Admiral Bradley said, his voice dropping an octave in sheer disbelief. "This final document. This is a printed email from Chloe Jenkins. She explicitly outlines a premeditated conspiracy to commit federal contracting fraud and intentionally frame a commissioned officer of the United States Navy for the resulting fallout." "That is correct," I replied smoothly, completely hiding the dull ache that still pulsed in my chest when I heard my sister's name associated with my planned destruction. The suspects actively conspired to forge federal compliance records. They intended to use my basic access credentials to bypass the secondary civilian audit. They fully believed I was an enlisted supply clerk, and they intended to let me face the mandatory minimum sentencing when the port expansion project inevitably collapsed. "This is not just white-collar financial fraud anymore," Bradley stated, his tone turning absolutely lethal. "This is a coordinated attack on a flag officer. We are looking at identity theft, wire fraud conspiracy to defraud the federal government, and violations of the Espionage Act regarding the handling of military credentials. With this photographic evidence and the active duress signature currently sitting in our system, we have absolute rock-solid probable cause. I can have federal arrest warrants signed by a judge in less than 2 hours." "Get the warrants, David," I ordered. "But do not execute them tonight. We are going to maximize the operational impact." I leaned back in my hotel chair, my mind working through the tactical geometry of the next 24 hours. My father had spent his entire life obsessed with his public image. He had emotionally crushed me repeatedly because I did not fit into the wealthy, powerful aesthetic he wanted to project to the world. He had constantly elevated Chloe because she played the part of the perfect socialite. Tomorrow night was their ultimate performance. Tomorrow night was the grand gala. "Tomorrow evening is the official corporate anniversary banquet and wedding rehearsal gala," I explained to Bradley. "Richard Jenkins has invited 300 of the most prominent investors, politicians, and socialites in the Pacific Northwest. He intends to use the gala to publicly announce the new $50 million Navy contract. He thinks this announcement will save his company and cement his legacy as a titan of defense logistics. So we let him build the pedestal before we kick it out from under him, Bradley said, a very faint, highly dangerous smile touching the corners of his mouth. Exactly, I replied. I want a fully coordinated multi-agency tactical sting operations set for tomorrow night. I want your best agents physically on the ground in Seattle by tomorrow morning. You will coordinate with the local Federal Bureau offices. We will seal the perimeter of the Emerald Crest Country Club at exactly 8 o'clock in the evening. No one enters and absolutely no one leaves until I give the command. Understood, Admiral. I will mobilize the West Coast Rapid Response Teams immediately. There is one more crucial detail, I added, feeling a cold rush of anticipation flow through my veins. Richard Jenkins believes he is securing this contract with zero naval oversight. I want to shatter that illusion in the most spectacular way possible. I need you to contact Fleet Admiral Catherine Miller at the Pentagon. Bradley blinked in surprise. The 4-star commander of the entire supply fleet. Yes, I confirmed. Admiral Miller is my direct commanding officer for this specific anti-corruption task force. I want you to inform her that the primary target has taken the bait and the trap is fully loaded. Request that she fly to Seattle tomorrow on a military transport. I want her to arrive at the gala as the unannounced, highly anticipated guest of honor. My father will be absolutely desperate to impress a 4-star admiral. He will bend over backward to kiss her ring. And then she hands the operation over to you, Bradley finished, completely understanding the psychological warfare I was preparing to unleash. I nodded. My family has spent 17 years operating under the delusion that I am a pathetic, useless subordinate. Tomorrow night, I am going to stand in front of their wealthy friends, their powerful investors, and the entire city of Seattle, and I am going to rip their criminal empire down to the studs. Get the teams ready, David. We drop the hammer tomorrow. Yes, Admiral Bradley replied, delivering a crisp salute before severing the encrypted video connection. The screen went dark. I sat alone in the quiet hotel room staring at my own reflection in the black monitor glass. I was exhausted, but I had never felt so powerful. I closed the laptop, secured it back inside the hidden compartment of my duffel bag, and finally walked over to the large window. I pulled the heavy curtain back just an inch and looked out at the dark, rain-swept city of Seattle. Somewhere out there in the wealthy suburbs, my father and my sister were celebrating. They were likely drinking expensive champagne, laughing at my perceived stupidity, and dreaming about the millions of dollars they thought they had just successfully stolen. They thought the hard part was over. They thought they had finally crossed the finish line. They had absolutely no idea that they had just initiated a countdown to their own complete and utter destruction. I let the curtain fall back into place, turned off the hotel lamp, and went to sleep. Tomorrow was going to be a very long day. The morning of the grand gala arrived with a bitter, biting chill that swept off the gray waters of the Puget Sound. I had barely slept the night before. My mind had been running through complex tactical scenarios, coordinating with federal agents across the country and securing the digital perimeter around my father's fraudulent empire. But when I stepped out of my rental car and walked through the heavy glass doors of the country club for the final day of preparations, I instantly buried the commanding officer deep inside. I reconstructed the mask they expected to see. I let my shoulders slump just a fraction. I softened my gaze. I became the quiet, submissive daughter they had spent 35 years conditioning me to be. The shift in the atmosphere was immediately palpable. Yesterday there had been a frantic, desperate energy radiating from my father and Trent. Today that desperation had completely vanished, replaced by an absolutely intoxicating cloud of sheer arrogance. They walked through the corridors of the country club with their chests puffed out, barking orders at the catering staff, and laughing far too loudly at their own jokes. The electronic approval for the $50 million federal contract must have hit their inbox that morning. They genuinely believed my forged signature had bypassed the military audit. They believed they had won, and because they thought they had secured their fortune, they no longer saw any reason to pretend to tolerate my existence. I found my mother in the main lobby frantically directing a team of florists. When I asked her where I was supposed to go, she did not even look at me. She simply pointed toward the sweeping staircase and told me Chloe needed assistance in the bridal suite. The suite was a sprawling, luxurious room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the golf course. It was an absolute tornado of discarded tissue paper, empty champagne flutes, and expensive cosmetic bags. Chloe was sitting in the center of the chaos, draped in a white silk robe, sipping a mimosa, while a professional makeup artist contoured her cheekbones. Trent was lounging on a velvet sofa in the corner, scrolling through his phone with a smug, self-satisfied smirk on his face. "Oh, good. You are finally here," Chloe said, her voice dripping with extreme condescension. The greeting lacked any basic human warmth. It was the tone someone might use to address a tardy servant. "I need you to go down to Trent's car. The valet has the keys. There are 4 heavy garment bags in the trunk, and the bellhop is taking far too long. Bring them up here, and then you need to steam my evening gown for the gala tonight." I stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the sheer audacity of her demand wash over me. I was a flag officer in the United States Navy. I managed international supply chains that funded entire fleets of warships. I commanded the respect of combat veterans. And here was my younger sister, a woman who had never worked a hard day in her entire life, demanding that I fetch her luggage and operate a clothing steamer. I did not argue. I did not point out the absolute absurdity of the situation. I simply nodded, turned around, and walked back down the stairs to retrieve her bags. True power never needs to announce itself. My sister needed to humiliate me to feel significant. I just needed to wait for the sun to go down. When I returned to the suite carrying the heavy, cumbersome garment bags, Chloe did not offer a word of thanks. She simply pointed toward a massive commercial-grade clothing steamer sitting in the corner of the room. The reservoir was already filled with water. "Do not burn the silk, Sarah," she warned, waving her hand dismissively. "That dress costs more than you make in 6 months at your little government desk job." I plugged the machine into the wall, waiting for the water to heat up. The machine began to hiss, sending thick plumes of white steam into the air. I unzipped the first garment bag and carefully pulled out a stunning, intricately beaded evening gown. I began to methodically press the steam wand against the delicate fabric, watching the wrinkles slowly smooth out. I focused entirely on the rhythmic, repetitive motion of the task, using the military discipline I had honed over 17 years to lock my facial features into a blank, unreadable state. Chloe watched me work through the reflection in her vanity mirror. The perceived success of the massive federal fraud had apparently emboldened her to strip away every last remaining filter. She wanted to hurt me. She wanted to make absolutely certain that I knew exactly where I stood in the family hierarchy before she married into her newfound wealth. "You know, Sarah, I almost feel bad for you." Chloe started taking another slow sip of her mimosa. "Almost. I look at you and I just see such a sad, deeply regimented life. You joined the military because you had absolutely zero options, and look where it got you. You are 35 years old, completely alone, wearing cheap civilian clothes and counting boots for a living. You have no real influence. You have no real money. You are just stuck in a dead-end military career, while the rest of us are actually building empires." Trent chuckled from the sofa, not even bothering to look up from his phone. "Do not be too hard on her, babe," he drawled lazily. "The world needs low-level clerks. Somebody has to push the paperwork, while the real players make the big moves. In fact, her paperwork skills proved incredibly useful to us yesterday." The comment was a direct, glaring reference to the fraudulent compliance forms I had signed the night before. They were literally gloating about framing me for a federal crime right to my face. The sheer arrogance required to taunt the very person you are currently setting up for a felony conviction was staggering. They felt completely and utterly invincible. "It is just pathetic," Chloe continued, leaning closer to the mirror to inspect her eyeliner. "Dad always said you were a terrible investment. He was right. Look at Trent. Look at the company. We just secured a massive financial windfall this morning. We are going to be set for life. We are moving into a whole new tax bracket, and you are going to go back to a damp warehouse to take orders from men who do not even know your name. I just hope you do not expect to ride our coattails now that we have real money." I kept my eyes fixed on the fabric of her gown. I dragged the steam wand down the length of the silk, watching the heavy vapor dissolve into the air. The irony of her words was so profound, it almost felt scripted. She was bragging about a financial windfall that was currently frozen in a federal escrow account by my direct command. She was mocking my lack of influence while armed federal agents were actively preparing to raid her wedding rehearsal gala, based entirely on my executive orders. "I am not expecting anything from you, Chloe," I said, my voice perfectly soft and compliant. "I am just happy to see you so confident about your future." She rolled her eyes and turned back to her makeup artist. "Good. Let us keep it that way." I spent the next 2 hours in that stifling room, carrying boxes, fetching coffee, and enduring a relentless barrage of passive-aggressive insults. I absorbed every single cruel comment. I gathered their mockery and stored it away in the cold, logical part of my mind. They thought they were breaking my spirit. In reality, they were just adding heavy concrete blocks to the foundation of their own impending prison sentences. Every insult fueled my resolve. Every condescending laugh guaranteed that I would not feel a single ounce of mercy when the trap finally snapped shut. By late afternoon, the preparations in the bridal suite were complete. The makeup artist had packed up her gear, and Chloe had dismissed me, telling me to go make myself look presentable for the evening, though she highly doubted that was possible. I walked out of the suite and headed down the wide, carpeted corridor toward the main lobby. I was halfway to the elevators when a hand violently grabbed my upper arm, yanking me out of the main hallway and into a small, secluded alcove near the country club library. I stumbled slightly, catching my balance on the mahogany wainscoting. I looked up to see my father standing over me. The smell of expensive scotch and peppery cologne was overpowering. His face was flushed with the thrill of his perceived victory. The charming diplomatic mask he wore for his investors was completely gone. He looked at me with cold, unvarnished contempt. "Listen to me very carefully, Sarah," my father growled, stepping so close that I was forced to press my back against the wall. "The compliance papers cleared the federal system this morning. Our company just secured a $50 million contract. We are stepping into a level of wealth and power that you cannot possibly comprehend." I kept my face perfectly blank, waiting for the final blow. I knew it was coming. "Which means we do not need your pity presence anymore after tonight," he continued, his voice dripping with pure malice. "For years your mother has begged me to include you in family events because she feels sorry for you. I only brought you here this weekend to secure that signature. You served your purpose. But once Chloe is married tomorrow, I want you to understand something very clearly. You are done here." He leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing into dark slits. "You are not coming home for Christmas. You are not coming home for Thanksgiving. You are an absolute embarrassment to the Jenkins name. You are a 35-year-old pencil pusher with no husband, no money, and no future. Every time I have to introduce you to my successful friends, I feel sick with humiliation. I am not going to let your pathetic dead-end life drag down this family's new reputation." The psychological warfare was brutal and absolute. He was explicitly telling me that I had been completely discarded. He had used my name to commit a massive federal crime, and now he was throwing me away like a broken tool, ensuring I would not be around to ask questions when the fallout eventually arrived. He believed he was severing the final tie. He believed he was the one walking away. And as for tonight, he hissed, jabbing a rigid finger into my shoulder, "This gala is the most important night of my professional career. I have senators, defense contractors, and major investors sitting in that ballroom. You will go to your assigned table at the very back of the room. You will sit down, you will keep your mouth shut, and you will stay entirely out of the way. Do not speak to my investors. Do not introduce yourself to the VIP guests. I want you completely invisible. Do you understand me?" I looked into the eyes of the man who had spent my entire life making me feel like I was inherently worthless. For 35 years, I had craved his love. I had wanted a father who would be proud of his daughter's service to her country. I had wanted a family that valued character over corporate greed. But looking at him now, I felt nothing but a deep, hollow pity. He was an incredibly weak man hiding behind a stolen fortune. "I understand, Dad," I said. My voice did not shake. It was perfectly level, devoid of any emotional reaction. "I will sit at the back table. I will not cause a scene." He scoffed a short, ugly sound of absolute victory. "Good. See that you do." He turned on his heel and marched out of the alcove, heading toward the grand ballroom to prepare for his triumphant evening. He walked with the heavy, confident strides of a man who believed he had conquered the world. I stood alone in the dim light of the library hallway, listening to the distant sound of the jazz band warming up for the gala. I reached into my pocket and felt the cold, hard casing of my encrypted cellular phone. The final pieces were perfectly in place. My father and my sister had successfully dug their own graves, proudly showcasing their cruelty and their criminal arrogance. They thought they had secured my silence through emotional intimidation. They had no idea that highly trained federal agents were already surrounding the perimeter of the building. They had no idea that a legendary 4-star military commander was currently landing at the local airfield specifically to execute a federal warrant with my name on the bottom line. I smoothed the fabric of my dress, squared my shoulders, and corrected my posture. The subservient daughter vanished completely into the shadows of the alcove. I walked toward the glowing lights of the grand ballroom, ready to take my seat in the back corner. I was ready to be invisible. I was ready to watch the entire Jenkins family empire burn straight to the ground. The grand ballroom of the Emerald Crest Country Club was a masterpiece of manufactured opulence. Stepping into the massive space felt like walking into a glittering illusion specifically designed to mask the stench of a dying company. Above us, 3 massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm prismatic glow over the sea of attendees. The tables were draped in heavy gold linens, adorned with towering centerpieces of white orchids and imported roses that probably cost more than what my father paid his warehouse employees in a month. The air was thick with the rich scent of roasted prime rib aged Burgundy and the heavy, expensive perfumes of Seattle's corporate elite. My father had left absolutely nothing to chance for this gala. The guest list was a calculated roster of vanity and desperation. I recognized local politicians from Olympia, wealthy tech investors from Bellevue, and a handful of prominent defense industry lobbyists who had been flown in just for the occasion. They were all standing in small, exclusive clusters, swirling their champagne flutes and laughing at each other's jokes. It was exactly the kind of high society event my parents had spent their entire lives trying to dominate. To anyone looking from the outside, Jenkins Global Freight was a roaring success, a titan of industry celebrating 30 years of excellence alongside the joyous wedding rehearsal of the founder's beautiful youngest daughter. I knew the absolute truth. I knew that the expensive champagne they were drinking was likely purchased on a maxed-out line of credit. I knew that the floral arrangements were a facade hiding an impending corporate bankruptcy. And I knew that the only reason my father was currently strutting across the ballroom floor with his chest puffed out was because he genuinely believed he had successfully used my name to steal $50 million from the United States government. True to his word, my father had ensured my seating assignment reflected my exact value to his empire. While Chloe and Trent were seated at the spectacular head table on a raised dais overlooking the entire room, I was placed at a small, dimly lit round table at the very back of the hall. I was seated so far away from the center of attention that I was practically in a different zip code. My table was positioned directly next to the swinging double doors of the main catering kitchen. Every 60 seconds, a waiter would burst through the doors carrying heavy trays of clearing tubs, bringing with them a sudden loud clattering of dirty silverware and a blast of stifling hot air that smelled strongly of industrial dish soap. It was loud, it was chaotic, and it was deeply uncomfortable. The few other people assigned to my table were an elderly great-aunt who was hard of hearing and a pair of low-level vendors who clearly knew they were only invited to pad the attendance numbers. The waitstaff practically ignored us pouring our water with hurried, careless splashes, before rushing back to attend to the state senators and corporate vice presidents at the front. My mother caught my eye from across the room at one point. She was standing near the ice sculpture wearing a glittering silver gown. She looked at my table, looked at my simple, unadorned civilian dress, and offered a tight, deeply patronizing smile before turning her back to me completely. She was washing her hands of me. She had allowed my father to exile me to the kitchen doors, fully endorsing my public humiliation. A younger version of myself would have been crushed by the sheer indignity of it all. I would have sat in that dark corner, fighting back tears, wondering why I was so fundamentally unworthy of a seat closer to the family. But as I sat there feeling the rush of hot air from the kitchen hit my back, I felt absolutely no sorrow. I felt the cool, detached focus of a military commander surveying a battlefield. In tactical warfare, the back of the room is exactly where you want to be. It provides the widest field of vision. It allows you to observe the enemy without being observed in return. From my dark little corner, I had a perfect, unobstructed view of the entire grand ballroom. I watched Trent Lawson working the crowd, shaking hands with investors, his smile wide and deeply arrogant. He was playing the part of the brilliant young executive who had just secured the future of the company. I watched Chloe floating between tables, flashing her massive diamond engagement ring, soaking up the praise and admiration of women she secretly despised. They were celebrating the victory they had built on a foundation of massive federal fraud. They had checked the contracting portal that morning and seen the initial system clearance. They believed my forged signature had slipped past the auditors. They believed the $50 million was effectively theirs. The sheer blinding hubris required to steal from the Department of Defense and then throw a massive party to brag about it was staggering. They were dancing happily on a trapdoor, and I was the one holding the lever. At exactly 8 o'clock, the jazz quartet abruptly stopped playing. A sharp, clear ringing sound echoed through the massive ballroom as my father stood at the head table and tapped his crystal champagne flute with a silver spoon. The low roar of conversation slowly died down, replaced by the rustling of expensive fabrics and the scraping of chairs as 300 guests turned their attention toward the raised stage. My father stepped up to the polished wooden podium set up in the center of the dais. He gripped the edges of the stand, leaning forward to speak directly into the microphone. His face was flushed with power. He looked like a king addressing his loyal subjects. "Good evening, everyone," my father began, his voice booming through the state-of-the-art sound system. "Thank you all for joining us on this incredibly special night. Tonight we are here to celebrate two beautiful milestones. We are here to celebrate the upcoming marriage of my brilliant daughter, Chloe, to a man I respect immensely, Trent Lawson. And we are here to celebrate 30 years of Jenkins Global Freight, a company I built with my bare hands, a company built on integrity, hard work, and the absolute pursuit of excellence." A round of enthusiastic applause rippled through the room. I sat in my chair near the kitchen doors, my hands folded neatly in my lap. Hearing a man who had falsified 3 years of safety records lecture a room about integrity was a unique kind of psychological whiplash. But 30 years was just the beginning, my father continued, raising a hand to quiet the clapping guests. As many of you in the business sector know, the defense logistics industry is highly competitive. It requires vision. It requires a relentless drive to secure the best partnerships for the future of our nation. And I am incredibly proud to announce tonight, surrounded by our most valued friends and investors, that Jenkins Global Freight has officially secured a new exclusive partnership with the Department of Defense. He paused dramatically, letting the anticipation build in the silent room. As of this morning, we are the primary logistics contractor for the Seattle Port Expansion Initiative, a $50 million federal contract that will firmly cement our company as the undisputed leader in West Coast defense operations. The ballroom absolutely erupted. People rose from their chairs, cheering and clapping loudly. I watched wealthy tech investors nod in deep approval. I watched local politicians raise their glasses in a salute. My father stood at the podium, soaking in the adulation, his eyes gleaming with sheer greed. It was a masterful performance. He was selling them a ghost ship, and they were all desperately pulling out their checkbooks to buy a ticket. I could not have achieved this monumental victory without my future son-in-law. My father announced over the dying applause, gesturing grandly toward Trent. Trent is a genius of corporate strategy. He navigated the complex federal bidding process with absolute perfection. He is exactly the kind of visionary leader this company needs for the next 30 years. Trent stood up, buttoning his suit jacket, and offered a humble, practiced bow to the room. I watched him from my dark corner, knowing that his brilliant strategy consisted entirely of stealing my name and forging my credentials. And of course my father said, his voice softening into a tone of deep manufactured affection, "My inspiration, my heart, my beautiful daughter Chloe. She has brought so much light to this family. She is the reason I wake up every day and push this company to reach new heights. To Chloe and Trent, may your marriage be as prosperous and successful as our new corporate future." And hi. The crowd awed in unison, raising their glasses to toast the golden couple. Chloe beamed, blowing a kiss to our father. The picture of the perfect American dynasty was complete. But my father was not finished. He gripped the podium again, and his eyes began to scan the massive room. He looked past the politicians. He looked past the wealthy developers. His gaze swept over the sea of faces until it finally landed on the very back corner of the ballroom. He found me sitting alone in the shadows right next to the swinging kitchen doors. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. He leaned closely into the microphone, his voice dropping into a tone of dripping condescension. "Now family is incredibly important to me," my father said, his words echoing off the high ceilings. "And I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge that my other daughter, Sarah, is also here with us tonight." 300 pairs of eyes began to turn. The guests seated at the front craned their necks, searching the back of the room. A bright, harsh spotlight mounted near the ceiling abruptly swiveled, cutting through the dim lighting of the ballroom and landing directly on my small table. The beam of light was blinding. It exposed my modest dress, the empty chairs around me, and the chaotic bustle of a waiter trying to sneak past with a tub of dirty dishes. "Sarah is not exactly a titan of industry like Trent," my father continued, his voice laced with a mocking, patronizing warmth. "She works a modest little desk job for the Navy. Just a clerk really counting inventory in a warehouse. It is a quiet, simple life, but it suits her perfectly." The silence in the room shifted. The guests were wealthy, sophisticated people, and they instantly recognized the deep underlying insult in his tone. They recognized the public shaming of the unsuccessful sibling. But my father added, his smile widening into a grin of absolute smug victory. "I am very proud to say that after all these years, Sarah finally made herself useful to this family. She helped us process some minor bureaucratic paperwork for the venue security. It was a very small task, but she handled it just fine. Let us hear it for Sarah, everyone. Thank you for finally pitching in." A ripple of low, polite laughter rolled through the grand ballroom. It was the sound of 300 people chuckling out of sheer pity. A few people offered a slow, patronizing golf clap. I could see Chloe sitting at the head table, her hand covering her mouth, as she actively giggled at my public humiliation. Trent was smirking, shaking his head in quiet amusement. My mother was staring intently at her champagne glass, refusing to look at me while her husband publicly degraded her eldest child. My father stood at the podium, staring directly at me under the harsh glare of the spotlight. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to flush red with embarrassment, to look down at the floor, to shrink away into the kitchen and disappear. He wanted to assert his absolute dominance one final time before he rode off into his stolen sunset. I did not break. I did not blush. I did not look away. I sat perfectly still under the blinding spotlight. I kept my back entirely straight, my shoulders squared with military precision. I slowly reached out, picked up my glass of ice water from the linen tablecloth, and raised it in a silent, steady toast directly toward my father. I took a slow, calm sip of the cold water, maintaining absolute eye contact with him across the massive room. My lack of reaction seemed to unnerve him slightly. His smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny flicker of confusion crossing his features, before he quickly turned back to the microphone to wrap up his speech. He thought he had just delivered the ultimate humiliation. He thought he had successfully relegated me to the role of the pathetic, useful idiot. He had absolutely no idea that while he was busy bragging about his $50 million fraud to a room full of witnesses, the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom lobby were already being locked from the outside. He had no idea that his perfectly orchestrated night was about to come crashing down in a matter of seconds. I sat quietly in my dark corner, placed my water glass back on the table, and waited for the real guest of honor to arrive. The spotlight clicked off, plunging my small table back into the familiar shadows near the swinging kitchen doors. My father stepped away from the polished wooden podium, looking incredibly satisfied with himself. He had delivered his punchline. He had established his dominance. He had made sure that every wealthy investor and political figure in the room knew exactly how little he valued his eldest child. The jazz quartet resumed playing a lively, upbeat tune. Trent raised his glass in a silent, mocking toast toward my dark corner. Chloe blew an exaggerated kiss to the applauding crowd. It was a perfectly choreographed tableau of a wealthy American family at the absolute peak of their social and financial success. But I knew it was all an absolute illusion. I sat with my hands resting quietly in my lap, feeling the subtle vibrations of the floorboards as waiters rushed past me with heavy trays. I was not looking at my family anymore. My focus was locked entirely on the massive double doors at the far end of the grand ballroom. I knew the exact operational timeline. I knew David Bradley and his federal agents had already secured the perimeter of the country club. The local politicians and tech investors were laughing, cutting into their roasted prime rib, completely unaware that they were sitting inside a sealed federal drop zone. The tension in my chest was not fear. It was pure, highly concentrated anticipation. I took a slow sip of my ice water, waiting for the hammer to fall. Suddenly, a sharp, incredibly loud metallic crack echoed through the massive ballroom. It was the sound of the heavy brass latches on the main double doors being forced open with absolute authority. The doors did not just swing apart gracefully. They were shoved open so violently that one of them slammed against the interior wall with a sound like a gunshot. The jazz quartet stuttered in shock, the music grinding to a complete and awkward halt. A waiter near the front of the room dropped a silver tray, the crystal glasses shattering loudly against the hardwood floor. The collective murmur of 300 wealthy guests vanished in an instant, replaced by a suffocating, terrified silence. Through the open doorway stepped Fleet Admiral Catherine Miller. She was a living legend in the United States Navy. She was a terrifyingly sharp, fiercely intelligent 4-star commander who managed the logistics and supply chains of our entire global naval fleet. She did not simply walk into a room. She occupied it. She claimed the space the second her boots crossed the threshold. She wore her full-dress uniform, the stark, dark fabric adorned with rows of colorful service ribbons, heavy gold braids, and the undeniable blinding weight of 4 silver stars shining on her collar. Her face was set in stone. Her posture was flawless. She radiated a level of absolute, uncompromising power that made every single civilian millionaire in that ballroom look completely insignificant. She was not alone. Flanking her on either side was a heavy security detail of uniformed military personnel, their faces locked in grim, unreadable determination. And directly behind them came a dozen men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers. The bold yellow letters NCIS were printed clearly across their backs. Naval Criminal Investigative Service. They fanned out the moment they entered the room, moving with silent, terrifying military precision to secure every single exit in the grand ballroom. They positioned themselves by the doors, their hands resting near their tactical belts, scanning the crowd with cold, assessing eyes. The wealthy investors and politicians in the room completely froze. You could physically feel the panic rippling through the wealthy crowd. These were people who spent their entire lives navigating corporate loopholes, greasing political wheels, and buying their way out of trouble. But staring down a phalanx of federal agents and a 4-star military commander was entirely outside their depth. The air in the room grew heavy and thick. People slowly lowered their wine glasses. No one dared to speak. My father, however, suffered from a terminal case of narcissism. Standing on the raised dais at the front of the room, he stared at the entrance for a fraction of a second, before a look of absolute greedy comprehension washed over his face. Because his ego was so massive, he did not see a federal raid. He saw the ultimate validation of his fraudulent empire. In his twisted, arrogant mind, the Department of Defense had sent a 4-star admiral to personally congratulate him on securing the $50 million port expansion contract. He genuinely believed this was a surprise ceremonial visit meant to honor his corporate genius. I watched from my dark corner as my father frantically adjusted his expensive silk tie and whispered something urgently to Trent and Chloe. The three of them practically abandoned the head table, rushing down the carpeted steps of the dais. They were practically tripping over themselves, their faces plastered with wide, desperate, incredibly fake smiles. They moved through the crowd of stunned guests, parting the sea of politicians and developers like minor royalty demanding a path. Chloe was lifting the hem of her expensive white silk gown so she could walk faster, eager to get her face in the inevitable photographs she assumed were about to be taken. Trent was right beside her, fixing his cuffs, projecting the image of a man preparing to accept an Academy Award. My mother Barbara trailed a few steps behind them, her hands fluttering nervously near her pearl necklace, clearly unsure of what was happening but desperately wanting to be part of the spotlight. They reached the center of the ballroom floor just as Admiral Miller came to a halt. The NCIS agents formed a loose half-circle behind her, their eyes locked on my father. My father stepped forward, his chest puffed out completely, ignoring the stern tactical faces of the federal agents. He extended his right hand in a grand welcoming gesture, a massive smile stretching across his face. "Admiral Miller." My father projected his voice so the entire silent ballroom could hear his triumph. "We are so honored you came to bless our new defense contract." He beamed at her, waiting for the handshake, waiting for the public praise he felt he was owed. He looked around the room, making sure the local senators and tech investors were watching his incredible moment of triumph. Trent stepped up right behind him, nodding eagerly, desperate to share the unearned spotlight. "It is a true privilege to host the Navy tonight," Admiral Trent added, his voice slick with corporate sycophancy. "We at Jenkins Global Freight pride ourselves on our unwavering commitment to federal excellence." Chloe offered a practiced demure smile, stepping close to Trent and resting her hand on his arm. She was clearly expecting the powerful military woman in front of her to compliment her stunning wedding dress and congratulate her on her upcoming marriage. They stood there in the center of the room, a trio of absolute frauds, waiting for the United States government to anoint them as untouchable royalty. Fleet Admiral Catherine Miller did not speak. She did not smile. She did not even blink. She looked at my father's extended hand as if he were holding out a piece of rotting garbage. She looked at Trent with a gaze so intensely cold it could have frozen the Puget Sound. The temperature in the room plummeted. The silence stretched out heavy and absolute, lasting for 5 agonizing seconds. My father's grand smile began to falter. The edges of his mouth twitched nervously as the severe, icy reality of the Admiral's glare burned into his skin. He slowly lowered his hand, his face flushing a deep, embarrassed crimson. The utter lack of validation clearly confused him. He opened his mouth to try another charming greeting, but the Admiral did not give him the chance. Admiral Miller turned her head entirely away from Richard Jenkins. She dismissed his existence with a physical movement so sharp and deliberate that a collective gasp echoed from the front VIP tables. She stepped forward, forcing my father to literally stumble backward out of her way to avoid being walked over. She marched right past him. She marched right past Trent's open mouth and his suddenly pale, terrified face. She marched right past Chloe's shocked, indignant expression. The heavy thud of her polished black shoes echoed across the hardwood floor as she bypassed the spectacular head table, bypassed the state senators, and bypassed the massive, expensive floral displays. The NCIS agents moved in perfect synchronization behind her, completely ignoring my family as they followed their commander. The entire ballroom held its breath. 300 pairs of eyes tracked the 4-star admiral as she cut a direct, unmistakable path through the stunned crowd. The wealthy guests scrambled to pull their chairs in, clearing an aisle for her as she moved with undeniable purpose. She was not heading toward the raised dais. She was not heading toward the open bar or the corporate banners. She was marching straight toward the dark, forgotten corner of the room. She was marching directly toward the swinging doors of the catering kitchen. She was marching straight toward my table. I remained seated in the shadows. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I watched my father spin around in the center of the room, a look of sheer, unadulterated terror finally breaking through his arrogant facade. The reality of the situation was finally crashing down on him. He watched the most powerful military commander in the building bypass his entire corporate empire and head directly for the dark corner where he had banished his eldest child. I could see the exact moment the panic truly set in. His eyes widened in horror. Trent took a sudden, panicked step backward, bumping into a waiter, his corporate confidence completely shattered. Chloe stood frozen in her expensive white gown, her jaw hanging slack as she watched the federal agents march past her like she was completely invisible. They were finally realizing that the daughter they had just publicly humiliated, the daughter they had fully intended to send to federal prison to cover their own crimes, was the sole target of the Admiral's attention. The room was absolutely silent, save for the sound of military boots approaching my table. The carefully constructed illusion of the Jenkins family dynasty was already dead. They just had not heard the final verdict yet. The rhythmic, heavy strike of polished military boots on the hardwood floor echoed like a slow, deliberate ticking clock. Every single person in the grand ballroom held their collective breath as Fleet Admiral Catherine Miller closed the remaining distance to my dark corner. I kept my hands folded quietly in my lap, feeling the suffocating, electrified silence of 300 wealthy guests pressing in on me. My father was still frozen in the exact center of the room, his arm half raised from his utterly rejected handshake, a portrait of absolute staggering confusion. Beside him, Trent Lawson looked like a man frantically trying to calculate a non-existent escape route from a rapidly sinking ship, while my sister Chloe simply stared with wide, uncomprehending eyes. They watched, paralyzed, as the most powerful military commander on the West Coast bypassed their glittering stage and halted directly in front of the small table by the kitchen doors. Admiral Miller stopped at exactly 2 feet from the edge of my table. The Naval Criminal Investigative Service agents fanned out smoothly behind her, a solid wall of dark windbreakers forming a secure, impenetrable barrier between us and the rest of the stunned crowd. The rich scent of roasted prime rib and expensive perfume was suddenly overwhelmed by the sharp, crisp smell of rain and tactical gear. Admiral Miller snapped her heels together. Her posture was an absolute masterclass in military discipline. She raised her right hand in a perfectly crisp textbook salute. "Admiral Jenkins," she said, her voice ringing out with absolute, uncompromising authority. "The perimeter is secure. Warrants are ready for your execution." The title hit the room like a physical shockwave. I did not rush. I took a slow, deliberate breath, finally letting go of the subservient, pathetic mask I had worn for 35 years. The weak, eager-to-please daughter died right there in the shadows of the catering doors. I pushed my chair back and stood up. I let my shoulders broaden. I squared my stance. I lifted my chin and looked directly into the eyes of the 4-star commander. I raised my hand and returned the salute with the exact same crisp, unwavering precision. "Yes, Admiral," I replied. A collective echoing gasp ripped through the grand ballroom. It was a sound of sheer, unadulterated shock from 300 people who had just watched a ridiculed supply clerk transform into a flag officer of the United States Navy. Near the center of the room, my father took a sudden, staggering step backward. The crystal champagne flute slipped from his trembling fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash, shattering into hundreds of glittering pieces. The sound snapped the frozen tension in the room. "Admiral," my father choked out. The word barely made it past his lips. His face had completely drained of all color, leaving him looking like a hollow, terrified old man. He looked at me, then at Catherine Miller, and back to me. His jaw moved wordlessly, unable to process the total destruction of his reality. I stepped out from behind the small table. I did not look at the kitchen doors anymore. I walked down the center aisle of the ballroom, moving slowly and deliberately toward the front dais. The crowd parted for me instantly. Wealthy tech investors, prominent developers, and state politicians scrambled to pull their chairs out of my way, their faces pale with sudden terrifying realization. They were no longer looking at the pathetic spare child of Richard Jenkins. They were looking at a woman who wielded the absolute crushing weight of the federal government. I stopped 10 feet away from my father, Trent, and my sister. The federal agents seamlessly adjusted their formation, flanking me on either side to secure the operational zone. "Dad," I said, keeping my voice incredibly calm and perfectly level. "I believe you told these wonderful guests that I count boots in a damp warehouse. I suppose I should clarify my actual job description for your investors." I let the silence hang for a moment, making him feel the crushing weight of the eyes watching him. "I am a Rear Admiral in the Naval Supply Systems Command," I announced, ensuring my voice reached every single corner of the silent hall. "A month ago, I was frocked and assigned to lead a highly classified task force designed to root out catastrophic contracting fraud on the West Coast, specifically the corruption surrounding the Seattle Port Expansion Initiative." Trent actually stumbled backward, practically knocking over an expensive floral arrangement. The arrogant, self-satisfied smirk he had worn all night was entirely gone, replaced by the panicked, hyperventilating expression of a cornered animal. "You see, Dad?" I continued, taking another slow step forward. "When you dragged me into that private office alcove and told me I was a 35-year-old pencil pusher, you were operating under incredibly outdated intelligence. You assumed I still held the basic secret clearance from my enlisted days. You thought you could use my military identification number to rubber stamp your fake compliance records and bypass the final federal audit." My father tried to speak. He raised his hands, shaking violently, trying to form some kind of desperate defense. "Sarah, please," he stammered, his voice thin and pathetic. "You do not understand. It is a misunderstanding. We just needed a routine reference for the wedding venue." I shook my head slowly, cutting him off with absolute chilling authority. "Do not insult my intelligence, Richard. I broke into your executive office yesterday evening. I opened your heavy steel filing cabinet using a hair clip as a tension wrench. I found the black leather binder you labeled Project Trident." A loud murmur of horror swept through the crowd of investors. Several men in expensive suits immediately reached for their cellular phones, likely preparing to call their own legal counsel to distance themselves from this catastrophic mess. I photographed every single page, I stated, locking my eyes entirely onto Trent. I photographed the fabricated safety compliance logs. I captured the doctored financial spreadsheets proving Jenkins Global Freight is entirely and legally bankrupt. I documented the forged insurance bonds and the massive web of phantom subcontractors you created to steal $50 million from the American taxpayers. Trent opened his mouth, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto a hot dock. He looked wildly around the room, desperately searching for an exit that did not exist. The federal agents blocking the doors shifted their stances, preparing for any sudden movement. But the most fascinating document I found, I said, turning my gaze slowly toward my younger sister, was an email printed in the very back pocket of that binder. Chloe physically shrank away from me. Her pristine custom white silk gown suddenly looked absurd and foolish against her pale, deeply terrified face. "You wrote a lovely email to Trent, Chloe," I said, letting a tiny fraction of cold disgust bleed into my clinical tone. "You explicitly laid out the plan to deceive me into signing the compliance addendum by hiding it under a stack of wedding venue security forms. You bragged about how your older sister would take the fall. You wrote that I would be the one going to federal prison when the fraud inevitably collapsed, and you called it a win-win." Chloe let out a high, strained, agonizing sob. She clamped both hands over her mouth, her eyes darting frantically toward her wealthy friends in the audience who were now staring at her with pure, unadulterated revulsion. The golden child illusion was completely dead. My father fell to his knees. He actually collapsed onto the hardwood floor right in the middle of his own spectacular banquet, sobbing openly in front of his entire corporate network. "Sarah." "I beg you," he cried out, completely abandoning his pride and dignity. "Please, we are family. You cannot do this to your own blood. You cannot destroy us." I looked down at the man who had spent 3 decades making me feel entirely worthless. I looked at the man who had invited me here solely to use me as a human shield for his own criminal greed. "I did not do this to you," I replied softly yet firmly. "You did this to yourself. When you pushed those papers across the table last night and demanded I sign them to earn your love, you sealed your own fate. But you made one fatal miscalculation." I gestured toward Admiral Miller, who stood watching the scene with stoic, commanding approval. Naval officers who manage billions of dollars in federal funding are taught a highly specific countermeasure for coercion, I explained to the breathless room. "When you forced me to sign those forged Department of Defense documents, I did not use my standard legal signature. I used a classified military countersign. It is a specific signature designed with microscopic, deliberate errors that instantly alerts the federal network that an officer is being extorted or held under duress." My father stopped sobbing for a second, his eyes widening in total despair as the reality of my words washed over him. The moment Trent submitted that contract this morning, the automated system froze the $50 million disbursement and immediately flagged the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I continued delivering the final crushing blow. "You did not bypass the audit, Richard. You literally handed the federal government a signed, verified confession of your own massive conspiracy." I turned my attention to the lead tactical agent standing to my right. "Execute the warrants I commanded." The room exploded into chaotic motion. A dozen federal agents surged forward in perfect, terrifying unison. They moved past the shattered champagne glass and the overturned chairs, pulling heavy steel handcuffs from their tactical belts. 2 agents grabbed my father by his arms, hauling him up roughly from his knees. He did not fight them. He just hung his head, weeping uncontrollably as the cold metal ratcheted tightly around his wrists. The titan of industry was nothing more than a broken, pathetic criminal. Trent Lawson tried to run. He spun around, shoving a terrified waiter out of his path and bolting toward the side exit leading to the gardens. But he barely made it 5 feet before 3 undercover agents tackled him hard to the floor. The sound of his custom Italian suit ripping echoed loudly over the gasps of the crowd. They pinned him face down against the polished wood, snapping the handcuffs onto his wrists with brutal, uncompromising efficiency. Chloe completely lost her mind. She dropped to the floor beside Trent, screaming hysterically. She beat her fists against the hardwood, her perfect makeup running down her face in thick, dark streaks. She threw a massive, unhinged tantrum in her expensive silk dress, wailing about her ruined wedding, her ruined life, and her stolen future. She clawed at the federal agents, screaming that they were ruining her special day, completely oblivious to the fact that her fiancé was being hauled away for massive federal contracting fraud and identity theft. "You cannot take him," Chloe shrieked, crawling on her knees toward me, her voice breaking into a guttural, frantic screech. "Sarah, tell them to stop. Tell them it was a mistake. We are getting married tomorrow. You are ruining everything. You are ruining my life." I looked down at my sister, watching her thrash on the floor of the beautiful country club she had mocked me for entering just hours ago. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt no sorrow. I felt the profound cleansing relief of a woman who had finally excised a highly toxic tumor from her life. "Your fiancé is going to federal prison, Chloe," I stated calmly, my voice easily cutting through her hysterical screams. "And considering the printed email evidence confirming your active participation in a conspiracy against the United States government, I highly recommend you find yourself a very good criminal defense attorney by tomorrow morning." I turned my back on her. I did not look at my father as the agents marched him toward the main doors. I did not watch Trent being dragged out in his ruined suit, while the politicians and investors scrambled to distance themselves from the entire family. I simply looked at Admiral Miller, who offered a single deeply respectful nod. The operation was a complete success. The corruption was dismantled, the family facade was permanently shattered, and the true admiral had finally taken command of her own life. The federal machinery moved with a crushing, unstoppable weight that left no room for appeal or maneuvering. Within 14 days of the gala, The entire operation at Jenkins Global Freight had been surgically dismantled. Federal marshals had arrived at the industrial headquarters shortly after dawn, their presence a stark contrast to the hollow manic energy that had defined my father's management style for years. They seized every physical ledger, every digital server, and every asset linked to the fraudulent port expansion initiative. I watched the live news feed on my hotel laptop, seeing the company banners being stripped from the warehouse exterior. It was a sterile, efficient death for a corrupt enterprise, and it felt like witnessing the final clearance of a long-standing, festering infection. Richard and Trent were indicted on a staggering 42 counts of conspiracy wire fraud, identity theft, and obstruction of justice. The evidence I had gathered in that leather binder, the photos of the forged compliance documents, the phantom invoices, and the internal correspondence had effectively paved the road to a 2-decade sentence in a high-security federal facility. The legal system did not care about my father's connections or his carefully cultivated reputation as a titan of defense logistics. It only cared about the millions of dollars stolen from the taxpayer and the deliberate, calculated attempt to ruin a decorated naval officer. Watching his mugshot appear on the local evening news, his face gaunt and devoid of its usual arrogant shine, I felt a strange, cold sense of closure. He had spent his life valuing power above people, and he had ultimately traded his remaining years for a cell. Chloe was the first to realize the true depth of the disaster, though she was entirely ill-equipped to handle it. The morning after the federal raid, the luxury apartment she shared with Trent was repossessed by the bank, as the lease had been underwritten by the same fraudulent company assets now held in receivership. The designer clothing, the expensive jewelry, the very life she had flaunted to make me feel small, it all evaporated like mist in the morning sun. She was suddenly facing the reality of being a disgraced socialite with a husband bound for decades behind bars and absolutely no legitimate income. My phone rang while I was organizing the final debriefing files for Admiral Miller. The caller ID displayed a blocked number, but I knew who it was. I could practically feel her desperation radiating through the digital signal. I sat at the small desk in my hotel room, looking out at the Seattle rain, and swiped to answer. I did not speak. I simply held the phone to my ear and waited for the sound of her voice. "Sarah, please." She began, her voice a brittle, jagged shard of sound that bore no resemblance to the confident woman who had laughed at my expense just a few days earlier. "You have to listen to me. This is all a horrible mistake. Trent is being held on a ridiculous bond, and I cannot access any of our accounts. You have connections, Sarah. You work for the Navy. You have to talk to your superiors and get them to drop the charges. You have to get me a pardon. I do not have anyone else. Mom is not talking to anyone, and Dad is already in custody. Please, you are the only one who can fix this." I let her speak, letting her frantic, selfish words fill the silence of the room. She was still trying to manipulate me, still acting as if my only purpose in life was to serve the convenience of her needs. She had not asked if I was okay after the trauma of the gala. She had not asked about my life or my career. She was only interested in her own survival. "I am a nobody, Chloe." I said, my voice as calm and steady as a mountain lake. "You told me that yourself. You told me I was a dead-end pencil pusher and a pathetic waste of a life. I am just a low-level clerk with no influence. I do not have the power to fix anything for you. But you have to try," she sobbed, her voice descending into a shrill, hysterical plea. "We are family. You cannot just let me sit here in this motel with nothing. You have to help me. I am begging you." I looked at the framed photograph of the Naval Task Force on my desk. The men and women I had spent months leading through the shadows of corruption. I looked at the official paperwork that confirmed I had achieved everything they had told me was impossible. "I do not have to do anything," I replied, my tone icy and final. "You spent 17 years treating me like a burden, and now you have to figure out how to carry your own weight. I am finished cleaning up your messes. You wanted to climb to the top on a foundation of lies, and now you have to live with the view from the bottom." I did not wait for her response. I did not care to hear another word of her pleading or her excuses. I simply ended the call and reached out to block her number, then blocked my father's, then blocked my mother's. It was the easiest, most liberating physical action I had ever taken. I set the phone down and watched as the notification screen went dark. The silence in the hotel room was profound. It was the sound of a life reclaimed. My mother, meanwhile, had experienced a fall from grace that was quieter, yet arguably more permanent. Without my father's fraudulent income or her socialite status to shield her, she found herself occupying a reality she had previously viewed with utter contempt. The colonial house in the suburbs was seized to compensate the creditors, leaving her with nothing but a minimal Social Security allotment and the lingering, bitter resentment of a woman who had spent decades enabling abuse. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that she had moved into a cramped single-bedroom apartment in a distant suburb, a place where no one knew her name or her past. She lived a life of quiet anonymity, relying entirely on the government checks she had once mocked me for earning. She was left alone with her memories of the life she thought she had earned, watching from a distance as her husband and son-in-law faced the consequences of the greed she had quietly championed. There were no more family dinners. There were no more invitations to holiday galas. There were no more moments where I was forced to sit at the back table or carry the heavy weight of their collective expectations. I had officially cut the umbilical cord to a past that was never built on love. I walked over to the closet and pulled out my crisp, pristine naval uniform. I spent time ensuring every ribbon was perfectly aligned, every star polished to a high, brilliant sheen. My life was no longer defined by the expectations of people who saw me as an accessory to their own success. I was Admiral Sarah Jenkins, and I had a fleet to command, a country to serve, and a future that belonged entirely to me. The weight that had once compressed my chest for nearly 2 decades had completely vanished, replaced by an expansive, exhilarating sense of duty and belonging. I walked out of that hotel room and stepped into the elevator, heading toward the lobby. I would not look back. I would not think of the tiny, dark corner table or the cruel, stinging words they had whispered in my ear. I was moving forward into a life that was finally unequivocally my own, anchored by the truth I had defended and the integrity I had never sacrificed. The silence of the city outside was no longer a void. It was an invitation to everything I had ever worked for. I was home, and I was exactly where I was meant to be, standing tall in the light of my own making, ready to begin the next chapter, without the ghosts of a broken, dishonest family haunting my every step. The work of the fleet would never end, but for the first time in my existence, my personal life was clean, clear, and perfectly mine. I carried my head high, knowing that the damage done to me had been healed not by their apology, but by my own strength and the unwavering justice of the system I served. The flight back to the eastern seaboard felt like traveling between 2 completely different dimensions. When the aircraft wheels finally touched down on the tarmac at Reagan National Airport in Washington District of Columbia, I looked out the small oval window and took a long, incredibly deep breath. The skies over the Capitol were a brilliant, piercing blue, a stark and welcome contrast to the endless gray rain and the suffocating deception I had just left behind in Seattle. I gathered my modest civilian luggage and walked through the bustling terminal. Nobody looked twice at the quiet woman in the simple navy blazer. To the hurried tourists and rushing politicians, I was just another anonymous traveler fading into the background of a busy morning. But I knew exactly who I was, and more importantly, I finally knew that my identity was not up for debate. The next morning, I walked through the towering, highly secured glass doors of the Pentagon. The atmosphere inside the massive building was a living, breathing entity of absolute discipline and unwavering purpose. As I moved through the wide, polished corridors of the E-Ring, junior officers and enlisted sailors stopped their conversations, snapped their heels together, and rendered crisp, immediate salutes. I returned each one with a steady hand and a calm nod. This was not the fake, hollow respect my father had tried to buy at his country club galas. This was a profound, deeply earned respect, built on years of shared sacrifice, mutual trust, and the heavy burden of national security. I stepped into my private office overlooking the Potomac River. The space was functional, orderly, and stripped of any unnecessary vanity. My heavy oak desk held classified briefing folders, encrypted communication terminals, and the complex logistical maps required to keep the United States Navy supplied and operational across the globe. I ran my fingers over the heavy silver star pinned to my uniform collar. The metal was cool and solid. It represented nearly 2 decades of grueling deployments, late nights studying supply chain dynamics, and leading men and women through highly volatile environments. I had earned every single millimeter of that star through pure merit. I had not bought it. I had not stolen it. I had not forged a signature to acquire it. In the days that followed my return to the capital, the final lingering shadows of my past simply washed away, replaced by the brilliant light of my chosen family. I was not alone in Washington. I was surrounded by a network of peers and mentors who knew my character long before they ever knew my rank. Later that week, I attended a quiet private dinner at a small seafood restaurant in Alexandria with several members of my command staff. Fleet Admiral Catherine Miller sat at the head of the table. The terrifying, unyielding commander who had single-handedly shattered my father's empire just a few days prior was currently laughing warmly, sharing stories about her early days in the Supply Corps. To my left sat Captain James Torres, a brilliant logistics officer I had mentored for 5 years. To my right was Commander Elena Rostova, a woman who had stood beside me during a deeply chaotic deployment to the Middle East. As the evening progressed, I simply sat back and listened to the easy-flowing conversation. There was no desperate posturing. There were no cruel, passive-aggressive insults disguised as jokes. Nobody at this table cared about the designer labels on their clothing or the make of the vehicle parked outside. They cared about integrity. They cared about honor. They cared that when the mission became impossible, the person standing next to them would not flinch, would not run, and would never leave them behind. I looked at the smiling faces of my colleagues, and a profound realization settled into the very center of my chest. This was what true belonging actually felt like. For my entire childhood and well into my adult life, I had contorted myself into 1,000 different painful shapes trying to fit into a space that my biological family had deliberately designed to be too small for me. I had accepted their scraps of affection, thinking that if I just stayed quiet enough, if I just proved my usefulness enough, they would eventually invite me to sit at the main table. But sitting in that cozy restaurant surrounded by people who would gladly lay down their careers to protect my own, I finally understood the fundamental tragedy of the Jenkins family. They were completely incapable of experiencing real love because they viewed every human interaction as a financial transaction. My father and my sister needed a scapegoat. They desperately needed someone to look down upon so they could manufacture a false sense of their own superiority. Their entire identities were built on the deeply pathetic foundation of believing they were simply better than the pathetic supply clerk. I had spent years wondering what was wrong with me, wondering why my own mother could stand by and watch me be humiliated, wondering why my own sister could actively plot to send me to a federal prison. I had carried their projected shame like a heavy rucksack on my shoulders. I set my water glass down on the restaurant table and took a quiet breath, finally unbuckling that heavy rucksack and leaving it on the floor forever. There was absolutely nothing wrong with me. The sickness belonged entirely to them. You cannot earn the respect of people who are committed to misunderstanding you. That is the hardest, most vital lesson I have ever learned. You can bring them the moon, and they will complain that the lighting is too harsh. You can sacrifice your own happiness to serve their needs, and they will simply step over you to ask for more. When people have decided that your designated role in their life is to be the failure, the punching bag, or the convenient stepping stone, no amount of logic, success, or kindness will ever change their minds. They do not want you to succeed because your success actively threatens the comfortable narrative they have constructed. If you try to prove your worth to people who are entirely invested in your worthlessness, you will exhaust your spirit and break your own heart. So I stopped trying. Years ago, when I first enlisted in the Navy and shipped out to basic training, I made the conscious decision to stop arguing with my family's deeply flawed perception of my reality. When they mocked my modest income, I smiled and nodded. When they ridiculed my lack of corporate ambition, I agreed with them. I allowed them to completely dismiss me. I allowed them to relegate me to the very back of the room. Sometimes you just have to let them underestimate you while you build your empire in the dark. I built my empire in the quiet, dusty supply depots of forward operating bases. I built it in the glowing light of encrypted computer screens at 2 o'clock in the morning, mastering the complex flow of global resources. I built my empire on the solid, unbreakable foundation of my own character. While my father was busy constructing a fragile house of cards using forged bonds and stolen taxpayer money, I was laying down bricks of absolute integrity. While my sister was busy cultivating a fake, heavily filtered social media presence to impress people who did not care about her, I was earning the unwavering loyalty of the men and women who defend this nation. I let my family think I was a nobody, because being a nobody to them gave me the incredible, glorious freedom to become an admiral to the rest of the world. The dinner in Alexandria wound down, and we all walked out into the cool evening air. The streets were quiet, the historic brick buildings glowing under the soft yellow light of the street lamps. Admiral Miller turned to me before she climbed into her waiting vehicle. She extended her hand, and I took it, feeling the firm, absolute strength of her grip. "You handled a highly volatile operational environment with exceptional grace," Sarah Admiral Miller said quietly, her eyes locking onto mine with deep professional respect. "The fleet is significantly safer today because of your unwavering discipline. I am incredibly proud to serve with you." "Thank you, Admiral," I replied, my voice steady and filled with genuine gratitude. "The honor is entirely mine." I watched her vehicle pull away, joining the steady stream of traffic heading toward the Capitol. I stood alone on the sidewalk for a long moment, simply listening to the distant sounds of the city. I was 35 years old. I was entirely single. I lived in a modest apartment near the Navy Yard, and I possessed a level of peace, power, and genuine joy that my father and my sister would never, ever experience in their entire tragic lives. The chapter of my life containing Richard Barbara and Chloe Jenkins was permanently closed, locked away in a federal evidence locker, and buried under the heavy weight of their own criminal arrogance. I did not need their validation. I did not need their conditional toxic love. I had a fleet to run, a nation to serve, and a brilliant unwritten future unfolding directly in front of me. I turned my collar up against the evening chill, smiled at the quiet street, and began the short, peaceful walk home. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. If my story touched you, or if you have ever had to cut off toxic family members who only wanted to use you, please take a moment to hit that like button and subscribe. It helps more people find the courage to stand up for themselves. Have you ever had to draw a hard boundary with your family? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Until next time, remember you command your own worth.